She was a governess, hired by a powerful duke with one simple, unyielding command: be obedient. But when she saw that his cold, rigid rules were not just shaping his grieving child, but utterly destroying her, she chose to break every single one. This is the story of how one woman's courageous defiance didn't just get her fired. It shattered a dynasty of grief, got her a marriage proposal from the most powerful man in the country, and started a social war she was destined to win. The rain fell in thick, relentless sheets over the slick streets of London, turning every cobblestone into a mirror for the dim gaslights. Clara Beaumont hurried along, her thin cloak soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. Her last shilling had bought her nothing but a newspaper, but the name Alistair carried whispers, and whispers in high society were seldom kind. Clara's heart pounded as she approached the looming stone gates of the manor. Vines clung to the walls, as if to soften its harshness, but even they seemed shivering in fear. Servants passed her by with stiff, judging glances, and she felt the weight of the air, oppressive, expectant, heavy with centuries of unspoken rules. She was about to step into a world where obedience was currency and rebellion could cost everything. The Duke's study was as intimidating as the man himself. Julian Alistair, the Duke of Alistair, sat behind an enormous mahogany desk that gleamed under the faint glow of a single candle. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his storm-gray eyes seemed to pierce her very soul. There was no warmth in them, only the icy calm of a man who had seen life take everything he loved and had learned to demand perfection in return. He did not smile. He did not rise. He simply gestured toward the chair before him, as though the very act of sitting was a test of courage. "You are Clara Beaumont," he said, his voice low and commanding, echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "I expect obedience. You will instruct my daughter, Lady Seraphina, according to the schedule and rules I have provided. There is no deviation. There is no leniency. Are we understood?" Clara nodded, swallowing her fear. She had expected a stern man, yes, but she had not expected the palpable chill of someone who measured not only time but human emotion with ruthless precision. He slid a leather-bound folio across the desk. The pages were filled with meticulous instructions. From lessons to mealtime conduct, from posture to speech, play was forbidden. Laughter was discouraged. Happiness was considered dangerous. She could feel the rules pressing against her chest like iron bars. Then she met Seraphina. The child was small, unnervingly silent, with eyes too knowing for her age. She clutched a delicate porcelain doll that seemed almost an extension of her fragile self, and she moved through the room like a shadow, barely disturbing the air. Her once lively cheeks were pale, her expression carefully neutral, as if any emotion might trigger a storm she could not survive. Clara realized immediately that this child had been imprisoned, not by walls, but by rules, by grief, by fear, by the unyielding control of a father who wanted perfection above all else. Clara felt a fierce protective surge rise in her chest. The Duke had hired her to obey, to enforce his rigid rules, but this child needed something far more vital than obedience. She needed life, warmth, and love. The choice was clear, though terrifying. She could follow the Duke's instructions to the letter, earn his approval, and leave Seraphina as a silent, colorless doll. Or she could risk everything, her livelihood, her reputation, even her fragile safety, to give the girl a chance to live. Clara squared her shoulders, met the Duke's piercing gaze, and silently vowed that she would do everything in her power to reach Seraphina, even if it meant defying the most powerful man in the country. Little did she know, that single decision, the choice to put heart above obedience, would not only change the life of one grieving child, but would challenge the Duke himself, shake the foundations of high society, and set the stage for a scandal no one could have anticipated. The storm outside raged on, matching the tumult growing quietly inside Alistair Manor. Clara Beaumont had entered the House of Ice, but she would not be frozen. Clara quickly learned that obedience at Alistair Manor was not just a matter of following instructions. It was a survival skill. Every movement, every word, every glance was measured and judged, not only by the Duke but by the invisible eyes of generations of expectation. Yet, It was the silence of Seraphina that struck her most deeply. The child moved through the halls, as if afraid to breathe too loudly, her eyes always distant, her fingers always clenching some token of the past, a ribbon, a doll, a forgotten book. Clara realized that the child's fear was not discipline. It was grief hardened into habit, sorrow woven so tightly into her being that it had become invisible to everyone else. The first lesson was a disaster by the Duke's standards. Clara had been instructed to begin with French dictation, but when Seraphina refused to speak a word, the governess made a choice that would define her tenure. She gently took the girl's hand and led her out of the cold, orderly nursery and into the manor's overgrown garden, a forbidden place where the wind tangled with ivy and the earth smelled of spring rain. "You don't have to speak," Clara said softly. "You just have to be." She encouraged Seraphina to touch the mud beneath her gloves, to chase butterflies that danced in reckless arcs, to press her hands into paint and smear it across a blank canvas. The child hesitated, terrified of transgression, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of joy appeared, a crooked smile, a small giggle, like a candle struggling against darkness. For Clara, the sight was worth any risk. She knew the Duke would be furious, but she also knew that Seraphina's soul was more important than any rule. It wasn't long before Julian discovered them. He appeared silently at the edge of the garden, his shadow stretching over the flowers and dirt-streaked dress of his daughter. The Duke's voice cut through the air, sharp and icy. "Miss Beaumont," he said, "I will remind you that your contract is clear. My daughter will adhere to my rules, not your whims." Clara met his gaze steadily, her own resolve matching the storm above. "She will learn," she said, "but she will also live." Julian froze, momentarily struck by her audacity. No governess had ever dared speak this way to him, least of all with such quiet dignity. Yet, when he looked at Seraphina, he saw the faintest glimmer of life returning to her eyes. He could not deny it. He could not dismiss her, and so, begrudgingly, he let her continue. Their fragile truce was immediately tested when word came that Lady Beatrice, the Duke's formidable aunt and a guardian of societal expectation, would visit the manor to inspect Seraphina's progress. Known for her ruthless judgment and unyielding adherence to tradition, Lady Beatrice's presence was a sword hanging over them both. Julian, despite his power, found himself dependent on Clara's ingenuity. She was not only a governess, but now a shield, navigating the treacherous waters of social scrutiny, while keeping Seraphina's fragile spirit intact. Clara prepared meticulously for the visit. She arranged lessons in ways that were unorthodox, but clever, allowing Seraphina to demonstrate intelligence, creativity, and poise without revealing the joy and freedom that truly defined her growth. She taught the child to speak with confidence in measured bursts, to answer questions with precision, and to perform tasks in a manner that would satisfy Lady Beatrice's exacting eye. When the aunt arrived, she expected silence, submission, and perfection, but she found a child who was alive, inquisitive, and subtly radiant. Clara's careful orchestration astonished the older woman, though she masked her astonishment with cool scrutiny. Julian watched it all from the study window, his hands clenching the edge of the desk. He could not admit it, even to himself, but he was grateful. Clara's methods, her care, and her unwavering courage had restored something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The icy walls he had built around himself over 5 long years were beginning to fracture, tiny cracks forming where light, and perhaps love, could finally seep through. But the outside world was watching too. The subtle triumph in the garden, the unexpected brilliance of Seraphina's presentation. These small acts of defiance would not remain unnoticed forever. Whispers among the servants hinted at discontent, while rumors in society would soon begin to form, threatening the fragile harmony Clara had established. Yet she did not falter. Each day she pushed further, not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because she understood a truth the Duke had long forgotten: children and hearts cannot thrive under cold obedience alone. They require warmth, courage, and the daring to break the rules. And so, the stage was set. A child reborn, a Duke silently observing, and a governess daring to defy the greatest authority in his life, slowly carving a space for life, laughter, and love amidst the rigid corridors of power. The first battle had been won, but the war for trust, for acceptance, and ultimately for love, was only just beginning. The first blossoms of spring did little to warm the manor, yet within its shadowed walls, subtle changes began to take root. Clara's quiet defiance had given Serafina a voice, but the child's trust and the Duke's attention had to be earned day by day. Each morning, Clara approached her work with a careful balance of courage and tact. She guided Serafina through lessons, allowing her imagination to flourish while gently bending the rigid structure imposed by the Duke. She whispered encouragement when the girl faltered and applauded her smallest victories, whether it was a crooked letter, a carefully recited poem, or a bright brushstroke across a canvas. Julian watched these lessons from the shadows at first, reluctant to intrude. Yet, over time, he found himself drawn closer, compelled by the life he saw returning to his daughter's eyes. One afternoon, he lingered at the study door as Clara patiently corrected Serafina's posture. Not with harsh words, but with a light touch and soft guidance. He noted the way the girl responded to Clara, not out of fear, but out of genuine affection. It was unsettling, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. The Duke realized, with a shock he could scarcely admit, that the governess was teaching him as much as she was teaching his daughter. The bond between Clara and Serafina deepened when Clara introduced the child to simple joys long denied, walking barefoot in the grass, listening to bird song, and painting with abandon. Julian initially resisted, convinced these liberties would undo years of careful discipline. Yet, as he observed Serafina laughing softly for the first time, dirt on her cheeks and a yellow smear of paint across her dress, he felt something he hadn't in years: hope. It was fragile and fleeting, but undeniable. He could not yet articulate why, but he knew Clara was the architect of it. The Duke's awakening was gradual. It began with small moments, a smile he found himself returning, a thought of Clara lingering in his mind, a fascination with the way she navigated both the child's needs and his impossible expectations. He was compelled by her intelligence, her courage, and the unexpected warmth she brought into a house he had long considered a tomb. Clara, too, noticed the shifts in him. The coldness in his gaze softened. His reprimands were tempered with curiosity rather than scorn, and in fleeting moments, she glimpsed the man beneath the mask of grief and control. A man capable of deep affection, yet terrified of losing it again. The fragile truce they had formed was put to the test when Julian received word of an impending dinner with a group of high-ranking socialites. The event was a gauntlet. Every manner, every conversation, and every gesture would be scrutinized, and any hint of impropriety could spell disaster for the Duke's reputation. Clara was instructed to prepare Serafina, ensuring the child presented as a model of composure and refinement. Yet, Clara saw an opportunity, not just to teach but to empower. She allowed Serafina to choose her attire, to speak with genuine enthusiasm about the day's lessons, and to share her paintings with pride. The dinner was a tense affair. Lady Beatrice and her peers evaluated every word and gesture, their eyes sharp as knives. Julian watched, anticipating disaster. Yet what unfolded surprised him. Serafina spoke confidently, answered questions thoughtfully, and displayed the quiet brilliance Clara had nurtured. The adults, initially poised to find fault, could only marvel. Even Lady Beatrice, ever rigid and unyielding, allowed the merest hint of approval to escape her lips. Julian felt an unfamiliar emotion, gratitude, pure and overwhelming. It was Clara who had achieved this, bridging the gap between societal expectation and human spirit. Yet, amidst this success, whispers of discontent began to form beyond the manor walls. Society, ever eager for scandal, had noticed the transformation. Clara's influence, though discreet, was becoming impossible to ignore. Some admired her courage. Others, particularly those invested in tradition and control, viewed her as a threat. The Duke sensed the undercurrent of tension and realized that protecting Clara and Serafina would require more than subtle vigilance. Despite the looming threat, Julian found himself drawn ever closer to Clara. Their conversations, initially confined to matters of duty and child rearing, began to wander into shared interests, books, and opinions. Clara discovered the depth of his grief, the moments of loneliness he had buried beneath his power and authority. Julian discovered her strength, her compassion, and the fierce independence that had led her to defy him in the first place. Each glance, each word was a tentative step towards something neither had dared name. One evening, a sudden storm swept through the manor, rattling windows and sending shadows across the walls. Serafina, terrified, ran not to her father, but into Clara's arms. Julian found them in the nursery, the child trembling and clinging to Clara as she whispered stories of brave knights, unafraid of thunder. Watching them, Julian felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. Clara's presence illuminated the emptiness he had accepted as normal, and for the first time, he questioned the rigidity of his life. Could he allow himself to trust her, to love her? The thought was dangerous and irresistible. By the end of this part, the Duke was no longer merely observing Clara's defiance. He was reckoning with it. He began to understand that obedience was not the only measure of loyalty or love, and that rules, no matter how rigidly enforced, could never protect the heart from longing, grief, or connection. Clara's courage had opened a door in both Serafina and Julian, one that could never be closed again. The stage was set for the next challenge: society's judgment, personal vulnerabilities, and the undeniable growing attraction that neither could yet name or fully resist. The days that followed the storm were quiet, but charged with unspoken tension. The manor, though still shadowed and imposing, seemed less suffocating now that Clara had gently pried a little life back into Serafina. The child's laughter, soft and rare, echoed through the halls, a fragile yet defiant rebellion against the cold order of the Duke's rules. Julian watched from a distance, torn between admiration and the dangerous stirrings of desire he refused to acknowledge. Clara's confidence grew with each small victory. She introduced Serafina to music, allowing the child to play simple tunes on a small piano tucked away in the corner of the drawing room. She encouraged storytelling, creating fantastical worlds where Serafina's imagination was the only law. Each success was met with subtle observation from Julian, who found himself increasingly unable to maintain the icy detachment he had cultivated for so many years. He was both disturbed and fascinated by Clara, her brilliance, her daring, and the way she seemed to breathe life into everything she touched. One afternoon, Clara discovered a small hidden stack of letters in Serafina's room, letters written in the child's careful, hesitant hand, never sent, addressed to her late mother. They were full of longing, questions, and the quiet ache of loneliness. Clara held them to her chest and felt the weight of responsibility deepen. She knew she could not simply follow the Duke's rules anymore. She had to protect the child's heart. That evening, she read the letters aloud to Serafina, gently answering the questions, comforting the girl, and allowing her to grieve in a way the rigid rules had never permitted. Julian, witnessing this, was confronted with a truth he had long avoided. His rules, his perfectionism, and his obsession with propriety had not protected Serafina. They had imprisoned her. Watching Clara gently guide his daughter's heart back to life, he felt a mixture of shame, gratitude, and something more primal, longing. He realized he was in danger of falling completely under her influence, yet every instinct told him to resist. Tensions escalated when Lady Beatrice announced her return, this time insisting on observing Serafina's progress over an entire week. The Duke braced himself, knowing that any hint of impropriety or imperfection would be magnified and used against him and against Clara. She, however, met the challenge head on. Each day, she allowed Serafina to express herself fully, guiding her with wisdom, patience, and just enough rebellion to defy the rigid expectations of high society. Julian watched, torn between fear of scandal and admiration for Clara's courage. It was during this week that a subtle intimacy began to develop between them. Julian found himself sharing opinions and ideas he had never voiced aloud, testing the waters of conversation beyond the practical matters of the estate. Clara, in turn, allowed herself small glimpses of vulnerability, sharing fragments of her past and the hardships that had shaped her. Their interactions were a delicate dance of proximity and restraint, filled with lingering glances, slight smiles, and the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual fascination. One evening, after a particularly trying day of scrutiny from Lady Beatrice, Julian found Clara alone in the library. The fire cast flickering shadows, painting her face in warm light. For a moment, silence stretched between them, a charged, almost unbearable pause. Clara spoke first, not of propriety or duty, but of the fear, hope, and courage that guided her every action. Julian listened, captivated by her honesty, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the walls of grief and rigid control. Their growing connection did not go unnoticed. Whispers among the staff, subtle glances at dinner, and society's constant scrutiny hinted that something unusual was unfolding in Allister Manor. The Duke's aunt, ever vigilant, grew increasingly wary, her disapproval simmering beneath the surface. Lady Annabel, a distant cousin with ambitions of her own, began to take an unhealthy interest in the household, watching Clara with a calculating eye. The seeds of jealousy, envy, and scandal were quietly planted, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Amidst this, Serafina thrived. She played, laughed, and created in ways that astonished both Julian and Clara. The child's spirit, once dulled by grief and oppression, was now alight with curiosity and joy. It became increasingly clear that Clara's influence was not merely beneficial. It was transformative. Julian, seeing the tangible proof of her impact, could no longer deny the depth of his reliance on her, both for his daughter's happiness and for his own. Yet, even as bonds strengthened, danger loomed. The Duke and Clara walked a precarious path. A single misstep could unravel the fragile progress they had achieved. The tension between societal expectation and personal desire grew ever more pressing, forcing both to confront the delicate balance between obedience, rebellion, and the undeniable pull of love. By the end of this part, the foundation for scandal, intrigue, and emotional reckoning had been laid. The Duke had begun to see Clara not just as a governess, but as an equal, a woman whose courage and heart challenged everything he had once believed. Clara, in turn, recognized the man beneath the Duke's icy exterior, and the possibility of love in a world that had offered her little hope. The storm of society's judgment was gathering on the horizon, and both would soon have to face choices that could change their lives forever. The calm after Clara's small victories was brutally short. Lived whispers had always circulated in the corners of Allister Manor, but now they sharpened into weapons. The household staff exchanged wary glances, servants lowered their voices, and even the footmen avoided eye contact with Clara. It was not long before the undercurrents reached the upper echelons of London society. Lady Annabel, a distant cousin with her own ambitions for the Allister legacy, had been quietly observing. To her, Clara was an intruder, an unrefined, low-born woman, daring to influence the Duke's family, and more dangerously, the future Duchess in training. Lady Beatrice, the Duke's formidable aunt, was already simmering with disapproval. She had tolerated Clara's small rebellions only because they seemed to yield results, but she would not allow the scandal of impropriety to continue unchecked. It was a delicate game of timing, appearances, and perception, and Lady Annabel played it ruthlessly. Together, the two women orchestrated a trap, subtle enough to escape immediate suspicion, but lethal in its consequences. One afternoon, Clara returned from a lesson with Serafina to find her modest travel trunk slightly ajar. Inside lay a piece of the late Duchess's jewelry, a ring so distinctive that it was unmistakably hers. Panic rose in her chest as she realized it had been planted. Before she could react, a messenger delivered a note summoning her to Julian's study immediately. Julian's office, always austere, seemed heavier that day. His gaze was cold, unreadable, as he motioned for Clara to approach. The Duke had been informed of the theft, and for once, there was no hint of playful reprimand or measured patience. All the evidence, circumstantial yet damning, pointed directly to her. His voice, controlled but tense, demanded an explanation. Clara, aghast and uncomprehending, could only shake her head and protest her innocence. The air was thick with tension. Julian, torn between belief in her integrity and the crushing weight of society's expectations, struggled to find a path forward. He knew that to openly defend Clara without proof would ignite scandal, yet, to punish her for a crime she did not commit felt like a betrayal, so profound it could shatter the fragile trust they had begun to build. Clara's dismissal was swift and absolute. She was handed a small severance, a polite but final declaration that her services were no longer required. The look in Julian's eyes, however, betrayed the war within him. He did not believe the accusation, yet he could not openly defy the scrutiny of his peers. without risking everything he had worked to preserve. The moment was a crucible. Clara left Alistair Manor, not just in heartbreak, but with the bitter knowledge that the world's rules could crush even the bravest spirit. Once outside the manor, Clara wandered the grey, anonymous streets of London. Every step felt heavier than the last. The fleeting hope, the laughter of Seraphina, the fragile bond she had nurtured with Julian. It all seemed gone, swallowed by the rigid, unyielding rules of society. Yet, within the despair, a spark of determination remained. She would not be broken. She had survived worse, and she had a life to rebuild, even if it meant starting over in anonymity. Meanwhile, Alistair Manor sank back into its former stillness. The House of Ice, once thawed by Clara's warmth, became suffocatingly silent again. Seraphina retreated entirely into herself, hiding behind her small hands, refusing to speak or play. Julian watched this transformation with growing horror. The emptiness that had been temporarily filled by Clara's presence now seemed insurmountable. Every laughless step of his daughter reminded him of the price of his adherence to rules and propriety over heart and justice. That evening, alone in his study, Julian faced a truth he could no longer deny. Clara's defiance, which he had once viewed as impertinence, was the very force that had breathed life back into his daughter, and ultimately into him. Without her, Alistair Manor had reverted to a tomb of grief and silence. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The rules he had so faithfully followed, the reputation he had so meticulously protected, were meaningless in the face of what truly mattered: love, trust, and the courage to act on one's convictions. The storm was far from over. Julian would not merely regret losing Clara. He would fight to reclaim her, not quietly or discreetly, but with the full force of his power, intellect, and unrelenting determination. Society's scrutiny, Lady Annabel's scheming, and his family's rigid expectations would all have to bend or break before he would allow the woman who had changed his world to slip away forever. This was the beginning of a reckoning. Julian Alistair, Duke of Alistair, would confront not only the machinations of the aristocracy, but also his own pride and fear. And Clara, with her indomitable spirit, would unknowingly hold the key to reshaping the very rules that had sought to confine her. The pieces were in motion. Scandal, strategy, and desire had intertwined, setting the stage for a confrontation that would challenge every precept Julian had ever believed in, and every risk Clara had ever dared to take. The days following Clara's dismissal were unbearable for Julian. Alistair Manor, once briefly alive with laughter and color, had reverted to its familiar, oppressive silence. Every corridor echoed with the absence of Clara's determined footsteps. Seraphina's room, once brightened by her hesitant smiles and the delicate brushstrokes of her paintings, was now a mausoleum of dust, covered toys, and abandoned canvases. Julian wandered the house like a ghost, each ticking clock reminding him of the life and joy he had allowed to slip through his fingers. But realization brought action. The Duke knew, with piercing clarity, that Clara was not merely a governess who had broken rules. She was the heart of their family. The force that had healed the child he had feared could never laugh again, and the only person capable of challenging and softening his own frozen grief. Without her, the House of Ice would remain just that, a tomb of rules, silence, and sorrow. He began a thorough investigation, employing his considerable influence and resources. Lady Annabel and Lady Beatrice had been subtle in their machinations, but Julian's reach extended far beyond the drawing rooms of London society. Within days, he uncovered the planted jewelry, the fabricated evidence, and the deliberate lies that had led to Clara's dismissal. Fury and admiration battled within him. Fury at the audacity of those who tried to destroy her, and admiration for the courage she had displayed, despite the weight of their scheming. Once the truth was undeniable. Julian's next step was simple and unrelenting. He would reclaim Clara. He tracked her to a small, dimly lit lodging room on the outskirts of the city, where she was preparing to accept another governess position. The contrast was stark. Here she was, dignified and defiant, even in exile, a woman unbowed by scandal or hardship. Julian arrived without warning, his presence commanding attention even in the narrow, cluttered room. Clara looked up, startled, her heart skipping a beat, not at the surprise of seeing the Duke, but at the intensity in his eyes. He did not begin with apologies or explanations. Instead, he spoke with a gravity that left no room for doubt. I was wrong. I dismissed you when I should have protected you. I allowed the world's rules to come between what mattered most. His voice, steady and unwavering, conveyed the depth of his realization. Clara's defiance had not been a threat. It had been a salvation. Clara's hands trembled slightly, uncertainty clouding her composure. Julian, you had no choice. I understand. You couldn't risk the scandal. No, he interrupted, stepping closer. I had a choice, Clara. And it was the wrong one. I let my fear, my grief, and society's judgment outweigh the truth of what you had done for us. But I will not let that happen again. And then, in a moment that would forever alter the course of both their lives, Julian dropped to one knee. The gravity of the Duke, the man whose presence had commanded entire rooms, now centered entirely on her. Clara Beaumont, he said, voice resonant and commanding, yet laced with vulnerability. I am asking you to be my wife, not despite your defiance, but because of it. Not despite the rules you broke, but because you broke the ones that mattered, the ones that held our hearts captive. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Clara's eyes, a mixture of disbelief, joy, and a lifetime of restrained hope, finally spilling over. The room, once dim and dreary, seemed to brighten with a sudden warmth. Her answer, whispered but resolute, carried the weight of every challenge, every risk, and every heartbeat she had survived. Yes, Julian. Yes. Their wedding was small and private, witnessed only by a few loyal friends in Serafina, whose laughter had returned brighter than ever. The house of ice transformed into a home filled with warmth, light, and life. Clara, now Duchess of Alistair, became a true partner to Julian, not merely in title, but in purpose, intellect, and heart. Together, they rebuilt the estate, nurtured Serafina's growth, and challenged the rigid social structures that had once sought to define and confine them. The victory was complete, not in wealth, title, or societal approval, but in love, courage, and the reclamation of a family once lost to grief. Laughter, genuine and unrestrained, echoed through Alistair Manor, a testament to the woman who dared to break every rule, and the Duke who finally dared to follow his heart. And so, Clara Beaumont, Governess turned Duchess, proved that true nobility was not in birthright, but in the courage to defy the world for love, justice, and the heart's unyielding truth.